this shows up on everybody's screen, hopefully. Can you see it, Carl and Adam?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, here's why I became so interested in the topic, and it goes way back when I was in graduate school. One of the jobs that I had to pay for tuition and board was selling books door to door, and I met hundreds, if not thousands, of people in various summers. And I started, even before I knew anything about type, realizing with some people you have to flex to the styles, and in literally 10 or 12 seconds, somebody's making a decision whether or not they're going to slam the door or listen to you. So I think before I even registered how important type was, I started recognizing that how important it is to read people and then flex and communicate in a way that works for them. And then later on, as I started working in the leadership field with the Center for Creative Leadership and another sister organization later on, every leadership program, whether it be with them or other competitors, were using typology, and then it was mostly the Myers-Briggs. And I loved it, and I got certified in it. And then for me, the question came, well, how do you make it more practical? How do you give people very practical and useful understanding how it plays out in all relationships? And for me, I had a nagging feeling inside that whatever the program, we really need to do justice to it and understand it, because type plays out in just about every domain of our working relationships: leadership, team, parenting, couples, as well as friendship. And if we don't have a practical understanding, we may, with the best of intentions and with integrity and even with a reasonable amount of emotional intelligence, trigger people without knowing it. So what I'd like to do is just share a few of the slides that I have. I've got more information than I think we can give in an hour or talk about, but I wanted you to have it for context as well. So the first quote I like is, how you see people is how you treat them. How you treat them is how they become. I think is very true, and it reminds me of the game that Eric Berne had highlighted in the 70s when transactional analysis or transactional awareness was very big, and now I see it making a resurgence in many areas, that we often act in a way to make people behave to justify how we feel, and then we get to see and collect evidence to say, well, see, it is so. And what I've also found over the years that when we judge somebody, one, I believe that we don't understand them, and the other part of it is if we judge somebody negatively, we can actually cripple them emotionally, and then actually act in ways to make them behave to justify this negative assessment we have of them. So what I'd like to do is move on and just highlight how important it is when we do have good, collaborative, trusting working relationships. It not only builds resilience, but Kurt Fisher from Harvard found that we work at a much higher level of complexity. So whether it be individual coaching, working with teams, or an organization, when you do have supportive, trusting relationships, people feel better. They're more engaged. They tend to work harder, and our brains work better. And I'm going to share with you also a couple of insights that came from the literature. First, James Hollis, an analyst, Jungian analyst I greatly respect, have been to a number of his workshops and have just about everything he's written. Well, he's found, as a Myers-Briggs expert, that the single largest cause of conflict between people is that they're simply operating from different typological orientations. So that, it's, for me, the way I would look at it as a metaphor, if somebody remembers The Odd Couple, this was years ago, and it made a resurgence on Broadway and a follow-up film. You have two people, Felix and Oscar, and one is Felix is incredibly neat, incredibly tidy, and then his friend, another person who's divorced, another divorced guy, is very sloppy and disorganized and fun-loving. And so you have a comedy series based on these two types living with each other. And Norman Mailer was asked one time, he did All in the Family and a number of other tremendous sitcoms. He was asked, and he said, well, I create the characters, and then the sitcom evolves from that. But if you understand typology, you can even be a great writer, or it can enhance your writing. The other part that I think is hugely important, the Gallup organization surveyed over 1 million people, and they asked them, one, why did you leave your job? And 4 out of 5, 800,000 said, I didn't leave my job, I left my boss. And it reminds me of the song from The Who, you know, won't get fooled again. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Well, what I found after doing this work over the last 15 to 17 or 18 years is that the names, the places, the people may change, but the similar dynamics, there are similar dynamics everywhere. And that's what, again, I see the types playing out, that if we leave our boss and we don't do our work, we may then find a new boss to be exactly the same, not exactly, but very similar to the old boss, until we figure out what we need to own, what we need to do to realize how we're contributing to the malaise, in this case, if we leave. The other side of that coin is that the most important factor in employee success is the relationship with their direct supervisor. You know, so a boss, when there's a good working relationship, respect, collaboration, trust, that can help activate higher levels of brain function and help a person do well. So again, the question of what's type have to do with this? Well, if you look at the costs of unaware bosses, if we're unaware of, let's say, our style, and we're unaware of the style or the preferences that somebody else is working for, we can be a perfectly good person but shut them down. And I'll just share a couple of these statistics. Again, the Gallup poll is found, again, after surveying 1 million people, the number one reason people quit is a bad boss. So turnover is mostly a leadership or management issue. When you look at work groups, if they're not managed well, they're less productive by 50%, less profitable. And the research by Inc. magazine said this phenomena, I'm quoting them, but I would reuse the word unaware because I don't put a moral judgment, good or bad, but if we look at it simply as unaware, it's costing the economy over $360 billion a year. So I take heart from that because there's plenty of work for all of us out there. There's a huge need to help bosses become more mindful, more conscious, more aware, and interpersonally skilled so they can be better leaders. The other part that, if you look at it one way, is somewhat disturbing is that 75% of workers report that their immediate supervisors are the most stressful part of their jobs. Isn't that interesting? So there is a huge need for the work that we do. Here's what I'll say about this slide. Patrick Lencioni made a huge splash with his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and now he's created 5 behaviors, I forget the exact title, but the 5 behaviors of high-functioning teams is the gist of it. And so he's actually using one of the personality assessments that's fairly common, the DISC, and using to integrate that to build trust. What I found here, which is very, very useful, is that when you have a team that is struggling, they don't trust each other, they're afraid of conflict. It could be, well, I'm not going to give the boss feedback, I don't want to be fired. And sometimes they're afraid of the boss's position, they're afraid of their strong personality, or it could be their personality is such that they're avoiding conflict naturally. But if we don't have trust and we avoid conflict and don't give and receive feedback well, we get into silos, and the bottom line is it does affect our results. So when we look at it from an emotional standpoint, most high-performing teams, and this comes from Barbara Fredrickson, down the road, I live in Chapel Hill, and she's at UNC, and her book on positivity and her research is that when high-performing teams have, on the average, 3 positive emotions to 1 negative emotion, you have all of these things that lead to team performance. People feel safe, they feel valued, they feel appreciated, and that sets the stage for high performance. But on the other hand, when we are dissonant, we make up stories about somebody that we work with is either too bossy or not, or too lazy or whatever. The dissonance is actually contagious, and the emotions then we trigger each other. Robert Cooper gave a good example of this. He wrote a book, Executive EQ, and what he found is a leader who's out of touch with their empathy or their emotions can actually impact the whole climate or culture of an organization. And so when it comes to leadership, I think this is why it's so important to work with people who are very influential. Now, looking at, let's say, how relationships affect our body or our central nervous system, what I'll say about this, and there's a robust amount of research that shows that when we have good relationships, it does affect our parasympathetic nervous system, and that profoundly affects boosting our immune system, helping with wound healing, as well as higher level brain function. And so when we, there's even studies that show that when we do something altruistic or helpful to somebody, it releases the neurotransmitter serotonin that has to do with mood. And so when we do something that we feel good about, that's making a contribution, it changes our chemistry in our brain in a very positive way, as well as boost our immune system, as well as digestion. So I'm not saying that stress should be completely eliminated. Some stress is good, but when we have chronic long-term stress, a critical boss, people who we feel don't value us, it does tend to activate our sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, and when it's chronic and long-term, it affects wound healing, digestion, as well as brain function as well. So I wanted to put that part into it before we get into now the 4 quadrants that tend to come up through history. So let me just stop real quickly in case some questions are coming up and we want to make this as interactive as possible. And if not, we'll take a look at an overview of, let's say, what all of these 4 quadrant personality assessments have in common.
Hi, Peter. It's Evelina. People are saying that these statistics are really fantastic. And the one question that has come up is, do you know offhand who did the research on the ratio of the positive to negative emotions and performance?
Yes. Her name is Barbara Fredrickson, and she is a psychologist at UNC. Barbara Fredrickson, I think you can Google her. She wrote a best-selling book on positivity, and she is on the lecture circuit, and she's done quite a bit of research on the effect of positivity and positive relationships on health, team performances, marriages, etc. Yeah, and she can even predict the success of a marriage by that same equation, 3 to 1.
Right.
And actually, it's actually 2.7, but to make it more palatable, well, let's round up to 3.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's all the questions that we have for now, but feel free to check back in.
Okay, super. Now, if you look throughout history, and again, I just included a few of the major personalities. If you look at the Greeks, they used bodily functions, and again, they were very brilliant to be able to say that some people are more choleric and sanguine. So throughout history, it seems to be 4 quadrants have been identified as the 4 different styles. Native Americans used north, south, east, and west personalities. You have the disc using letters. You have colors. And so what I thought would be most helpful is to just take out any particular personality, look at what they all have in common, and use words like driver. If you look at 3 o'clock, driver, analytical, relationship, and expressive. And then we're going to also look at, on the next slide, introvert, extrovert. The Myers-Briggs also started with Carl Jung, who looked at the 4 archetypal personalities that he had noticed as well. And then later on, it evolved into the Myers-Briggs when you had Isabel Myers and her daughter work with that, and then it became widely used, millions and millions of people using it. So what I'd like to do is start at 3 o'clock with the driver, and what I'm going to share is what I've learned throughout the last 15 or 17 years on how these play out, some comments that I think are important to really understand about personality, and then how what doesn't come naturally can be developed. So when we look at personality, the first thing I'll say, I don't think it's a very good tool for selection or promotion, if that makes sense, because what doesn't come naturally can be learned. And this is why we have places like the Center for Creative Leadership, coaching, training, team building, because as we grow in responsibility, we need to become more aware and more mindful and aware of others and understand how to engage them. And unless we do that, and if we're left to our own devices, it's very easy to trigger people and then make up a story. Well, what's wrong with them? It's kind of like throwing out a hand grenade and saying, look at these explosions. I don't like that. So let's start with the driver. And typically, again, regardless of what personality assessment you favor or use, you know, most of the folks that I've seen who are drivers, bulldozers, results-oriented, they have the hard skills. And believe it or not, most of the people who get referred to me tend to be in this quadrant where they're driver. Let's say this half of the equation, let's say, and many of them are driver analytical, and some of them are driver expressive. But the drivers tend to have the hard skills. They're driven, they're competitive, they're results oriented, They're impatient, and so that's what gets them to higher levels of management. And it doesn't mean at all that they're good leaders. It just means they get energy being in charge and control. That's one of their motivating factors. They're to achieve, to manage, to be in charge. And what gets them in trouble if they don't learn the soft skills, which means being appreciative, caring, listening, and developing empathy. And some of these are emotional intelligence competencies, being able to be aware of their emotions and trigger and positive emotions in others. And what happens, there's a saying, our strengths overused or misused gets in the way, impedes the very things you want most desperately in life. In other words, I like to say this, that what we're unaware of is going to slap us in the face. And so you have, and this is from research, I'll quote Mike Lillibridge, a psychologist who developed the Peoplemap, another very useful 4-quadrant personality assessment. What he found in his research that only about 10% of the population test out as drivers, yet 90% of this director level and above tend to be these driver types. Whether if you use Peoplemap Leader, the DISC, D, or whatever the quadrant assessment that you're using, that they tend to get in positions of authority because they are so driven and they have these hard skills. But then what gets them in trouble is not learning the soft skills. In fact, the Center for Creative Leadership in a 33-year study of executive derailment, defining derailment as not getting the promotion, not being successful, or even losing your job, they found that the #1 factor is the inability to build trusting, collaborative relationships. So one way of looking at it, our virtues become our vices if they're overused, and so the drivers tend, if they're not aware and if they overuse their strengths, they may then shut down the other folks. So for instance, let's go across now to 9 o'clock. Let's go to the polar opposite, you might say, those that are more relationship oriented, and the DISC, it would be the S, the Peoplemap would be people types, and then you have the same type of phenomena with seemingly all the other assessments, that those that are more relationship oriented, on the Myers-Briggs it would be the Fs, they tend to be kind, helpful, people oriented, and they have the soft skills. And think about this, what if somebody is too nice, too caring, or has too much empathy? What would their life be like? What I found, regardless of where I go, nonprofit, hospitals, institutions, these folks with the soft skills make wonderful nurses, wonderful psychologists, wonderful coaches, and yet if they don't learn the hard skills like setting boundaries, being assertive, saying no, and stepping up to the plate with conflict, their life can be very miserable because inadvertently, unconsciously, they may train people to take advantage of them. And then you have the drivers that would think, well, if there's a problem, why didn't people tell me? And then people who are relationship might make up a conclusion where they're too bossy and they're not nice. And then what happens, you see one shutting down the other, and then the other reacting to a behavior, and then triggering the other as well. And so you can see how one side can trigger the other side. And if you have two people working together, one with hard skills who hasn't learned the soft skills, and one that has soft skills and hasn't learned the hard skills, can you imagine what life would be like in a marriage or a team or workplace? Statistically, again, from Mike Lillibridge, if you look at this half of the equation, about 68% roughly of the population tend to be relationship oriented. So they could be relationship analytical, relationship expressive. If we had a 3D version of this, you also have a phenomena where they can be relationship and drivers at the same time. And so
Peter,
Peter, yes.
There are some questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Certainly. I got 3 interesting ones here. What is the difference between being a driver and being extroverted? That's the first one.
Okay.
Is there a relation between these quadrants and the AQAL equal from Ken Wilber? And second one, how does this model account for context and situation? I let you freewheel a little bit on those 3.
Okay. Let me see if I got it. So how does it relate to extroversion? And then could you repeat the second one again? And this was with Kenneth Wilber?
Yes. How does this model relate between the quadrants and the equal from Ken Wilber?
Okay, very good. And the third again?
How does this model account for context and situation?
say, I didn't quite grasp that. One more time, please, Carl.
How does this model account for context and situation? How does it take in account?
Okay, context, right, and situation. Okay, very good, thank you. What I'd like to do, let me answer 1 and 3 first, and then let's hold Kenneth Wilber in our back pocket. I really like him. And you know, his models of development, moral development, spiritual. There's so many things that we can tie into. Hopefully, I can do justice to him. But the first thing. The next slide, we're going to look at extroversion and introversion. But before we get there, it's a really great question. You can be an extroverted driver, or you can be an introverted driver. And I think the DISC, you know, kind of does a little bit different with that. But what I have found, you can be, let's say, the overuse of being a driver, being a bulldozer. You can be introverted or extroverted. You can be relationship-oriented. You can be introverted or extroverted. Or if you're more task-oriented and analytical, you can do that in an introverted or extroverted way, as well as expressive. So it's a great question, and I felt that needed its own slide to take a look at how extrovert and introvert plays out, as well as conflict in working relationships. So that's wonderful. So we're going to even continue that. Now, when we go to context and we look at, well, the fundamental attribution error in sociology does state that a lot of our behavior is a function of the environment that we're in. And so one of the ways that I use this is actually to help the environment and change the environment so that you can actually help each of the types grow and thrive. And I'll give you one example. I work with a nonprofit organization, and in the senior team of directors, everybody there was driver analytical, and there was 5 out of 6 were driver analytical, and 1 was driver expressive. And so when they brought me in because morale was low, engagement was low, passive-aggressive was high, passive-aggressive behaviors, the gossiping, the backbiting, and the initiative was waning. And so when we looked at the profile of a senior team, there's a mantra for the driver analytical: help me be open to other people's ideas, wrong as they may be. And so these folks, when you have this together, or if a person is in this quadrant, they're smart, they're driven, they're capable. And the strength of somebody who's analytical is they're great system makers. The overuse of that strength is they could be perceived as dictators. And so in this nonprofit, as I've seen with many nonprofits, the vast majority of staff were relationship-oriented. They were kind, caring, helpful. They avoided conflict, and they were fearful of management. I think 1, the personality; 2, because they were the boss, and so thus the surveys were very negative. So as a result of the work, partly the result of the work, they did bring in 2 women who were more relationship-oriented. They were people types. Let's use that word. And so part of the work of the senior team was, 1, to have these very strong, driven individuals that were on the senior team make sure they heard the perspective and the feedback of those that were more relationship-oriented. So again, great business decisions, but have you thought about how to communicate it? Have you thought about how this would impact morale? And so then those that were more relationship-oriented, they committed to being more assertive with the driver types, and those that were in that quadrant committed to making it safe and listening and incorporating that perspective into their decisions. In a short amount of time, the whole culture of that organization changed dramatically. So this is another, I think, point that's hugely important with personality, is that there is not one type that's good for leadership. You know, all types have tremendous leadership capacity. It's just we have to get sometimes out of our comfort zone and learn what's not natural. And so those that are kind and helpful, they've got to learn the hard skills, just as those that are driven and bulldozers have to learn the soft skills. And so when you do the work as a team, or you do it as an organizational development initiative, you're actually working with the culture so that people can then work on the behaviors that are going to help them be more successful and professional and grow in meeting the vision, the mission of the organization or the team, if that helps. So that's how I would look at it 2 ways. You're working with individuals, but you're also working so that you're changing the climate of the organization. And the other part of that is that we do not want to look at personality for hiring, for actually promoting. but yet I will say that this gives a very good case that you certainly need a diversity of type in senior teams. And what happens, because those that are more relationship either don't have energy being in charge, or they haven't yet developed the hard skills, often they don't throw their hat in the ring. And those that are the bulldozers often are driven, and they may get responsibility before they've really developed the necessary competencies to create followership, if that makes sense.
Yes, so, I think so, Peter. Thank you. There's one more question on this slide. That is the meaning of the formula. X2 plus Y2 is 4.
Okay. Well, that's just on there. I wouldn't put any real meaning to it. I think the way that I would look at it is that if you look at personality as like a soup or a mix or an equation, if the equation is too imbalanced to, let's say, one side, you may not get the engagement, performance, and good relationships. So I think with this, when I looked at all kinds of models, this to me seemed like the best way to put an XY axis and to put these on here. But I wouldn't read too much into that. Just that if you look at a leader who's able to be open to new ideas and can see the big picture. When you look at a high-performing team, you have innovation, that would be expressive. You have results, that's the leader types. The bulldozers, you have accountability, those that are more detail-oriented, system makers, and you have good relationships. When you have all of this in balance, you have the elements of a healthy company, a high-performing team. I'll say one more thing. There was a book that was written years ago. It was called From Barbarians to Bureaucrats. And in the language that he used, he called the barbarians the expressive types. This would be the Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs. They have the big ideas, the big vision. And then you get the bureaucrats, then he called those that are analytical. They create policies, procedures, so human resources, payroll, procedures, systems in place. And so his point was the beginning of a death cycle of a company is when the expressives, the creative, the free thinkers, those that need a lot of independence and autonomy, when they're driven away, that becomes the end of the life cycle of the company, or the beginning of the end, is because you have to have all of these for an organization to meet the ever-changing needs of society, whatever they do, whether they're nonprofit, high-tech, or whatever. You've got to have innovation, you've got to have results, you've got to have good relationships, and you have to have processes. So every type brings something to the table, and yet it's almost like we're manufactured for misunderstanding unless we learn to adopt the skills that aren't naturally and learn to understand others and learn how to communicate with them in a way that works for them. And I think that's really the point of looking at that equation, is that when it's balanced, it's going to work. When it's imbalanced, I think we run into problems. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just say quick something about Kenneth Wilber before we go into extrovert, introvert. You know, one of the things that I like about his models, when you look at moral development, you know, he says very simply, we move from me, we move to us, we move to all of us. And that correlates very, very closely to being egocentric, all about me, to being ethnocentric, you know, my group, my society, my religion, etc., and then being world-centric, which is I care about everybody. And you can also make a link to Kohlberg's 3 levels of moral development: pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, which we won't get into. So when you look at type, I see it as somewhat parallel. So you could be, let's say it's all about us, and you can be healthy, and you can take your religion, your leadership, whatever, and you can do what's best for us. But then when you become more conscious, or let's say super conscious, as Kenneth Wilber might say, that us becomes larger, and then my skills, my hard skills, or whatever skills I have from personality issue, then become applied to whatever level of development that I'm in. So I see his model being very, very complementary to working with type as well. So hopefully that helps enough at least, but I think it's a wonderful question, certainly a wonderful question. Looking at introvert extroversion, and again, if you go back to the insight from James Hollis that most conflicts revolve from just simple differences in types, I often do use the introvert extrovert as a part of the work that I do with teams as well as individuals. And if you look at trust, for instance, when somebody is introverted, their energy, their focus is internal. They can be very, very deliberate, very thoughtful, and often won't say anything unless they've given quite a bit of consideration and thought. So in other words, they think in order to talk. And so the I's are just different. I tend to be an extrovert, although I do have some spikes of introversion. And so we think out loud. For me, doing webinars like this, talks, teamwork, energizes me tremendously, and we often talk in order to think. And here's where trust plays in. Since I's don't often voice a thought before it's considered, the E's need to talk and feel intrusive and often untrustworthy. And from an extroverted standpoint, if we feel we're being trusting and open, so I hear people say, oh, I'm just being direct. What's the problem? I'm just being direct. I tell it like it is. Well, if the I's don't talk, then the extroverts feel untrusted and they may shut down. So here's just another way that, I do incorporate one aspect of Myers-Briggs into the 4 quadrants. And again, I love the Myers-Briggs, but for me, whenever I do work, I try to say, how do we make it practical? How do we make it so people can get it? How do we make it so people can remember it? And so I try to translate it into terms like that. And I think the Myers-Briggs is certainly a very good follow-up to work with any 4 quadrants. It gives some nuances. But the way that I look at it, it's when you work with a very practical 4 quadrant and speak in plain languages, that's the ABCs or the simple arithmetic. And then the Myers-Briggs is another level up. And it's certainly wonderful, validated, but I tend to position it in a different way than the getting individuals to better accept themselves, accept others, and then learn how to flex other styles. And one more thing that I'll say about type in this work is that when we learn to accept people, regardless of what typology or what assessment that we're using, we now recognize that, that's how that person is. I have empathy for them. And then what happens, I'm less likely to judge them, and I'm less likely to take it personally when somebody, let's say, is too bossy or when someone's too sensitive. That's how they are, and now that I accept them and I have empathy, that gives me a real clue into how to better relate to, lead, work with, or be friends with someone. So I think that the empathy, if we forgot everything else, having empathy, that gives us the ability to do the right thing or to respond to somebody's needs. So here's one way to summarize the MBTI and recognizing when I got certified in it, took weeks and weeks and weeks, and then a workshop. One of the things that I personally felt in many leadership programs, as valuable as the MBTI is, it is difficult to do justice to it in half a day. So I tend to reserve it for when I can spend more time one-on-one with somebody, or work with it more in depth when it does when there's a longer team engagement. Anyway, I like what Carl Jung wrote about the MBTI, and again, it highlights how important it is that each of us, regardless of our typology, has a very valuable perspective. So Jung wrote that sensing tells me that something is, intuiting tells me where something is going, thinking tells me what a thing is, and then feeling tells me what a thing is worth. And that's why I think it's so important that we recognize and celebrate the differences that we have and incorporate the differences, and then make sure that we don't get to that place, which I think all of us have, myself included. I used to think, wouldn't it be great if everybody was just like me? And then I realized wrong. There's some, especially if they're not aware of their blind spots or their overuse or misuse of their strengths, could be a very problematic world if everybody was the same. So when you think about celebrating diversity, I think it's important to consider celebrating diversity of type and then having the right chemistry. I think Carl Jung wrote that when two personalities meet, it's like a chemical reaction. Both are transformed. And if we do it with awareness and acceptance, that transformation can be very, very positive, and it can impact a marriage, parenting, as well as an organization or team. So what I'd like to do, and I'm going to be mindful that about 11:45 we'll open it up for question and answer. What I would like to do is just look at, again, another 4 quadrant of behaviors that, and the reference list I've referenced where this has come from. This came from originally that I saw a book in the 70s about transactional awareness. And I've also heard one woman who does quite a bit of work and has done brilliant work, Hope Hills, on the interpersonal circle. What my understanding is this came all the way back from Timothy Leary in the 50s when he was a brilliant Harvard psychologist. He found that you can classify behaviors into 4 quadrants as well. And this was, of course, before he did his experiential work with LSD. And then he was no longer in Harvard. Interestingly, his office mate later became known as Ram Dass. And Ram Dass went to India, came back, and then he brought meditation to the country to also work with higher levels of consciousness. So again, very interesting things coming out of Harvard in the 50s. So we can look at behavior as either dominant, submissive, hostile, or friendly. And you can also, what I have found is that you can also place, when each type gets into their danger zone, we'll look at this, they actually get into one of these quadrants of behaviors, which we'll go back to in just a bit. So under stress or tension, the Ds, the drivers, the directors, whatever word you want to use, they can be dominant. They can dominant, attack, push the envelope, and they can be seen as dominant, hostile. And then you go to the expressives, they tend to blame, they often are the rebels, they're the change agents. If their ideas aren't listened to, or if someone's too controlling, they may leave, or worse, be unhappily employed and stay. And those that are amiable, the people types, the feeling types, the S, the steadiness and DISC, they tend to have a tendency to become passive-aggressive, to withdraw, tolerate. So they shut down, they avoid conflict, and then they ruminate. And so they become, in this model, submissive, hostile. And then those that are the C's, the analytic, the task-oriented folks, those that are the C's and the DISC, they tend to, they can be very critical, they can be very judgmental, they can also be avoidant and drive into the work. You've heard the saying, some folks have a hard time seeing the forest through the trees, and so when they overdo it, they tend to work too hard and focus so much on details that they may lose track of the big picture, what's really important. So now let's go back to the 4 quadrants. And when you have, let's say, the high Ds over here in dominant hostile behavior, they trigger submissive hostile behavior. And what happens then, this becomes a self-reinforcing cycle of negativity where each can make up a story. Their perception is, well, they're too bossy. They don't care about me. They don't care about results. I'm out of here if I get a better job. And then what they're saying, you know, why am I the only one that cares? People are only here for a paycheck. They're not engaged. Why is it so hard to find motivated employees? I've often heard, well, you know, I've heard this in academic settings. They're just not connected to they're just not connected to the vision of helping students. So we make up stories based on what we see around us. You know, the good book even said we can see the splinter in somebody else's eyes, but we can't see the log in our own. So what happens, I find these models very useful to help people understand the impact of their behaviors, which is really a tenet of psychological maturity. I accept myself, I accept you, and I'm responsible for how I impact you. So how do we turn this around? On paper, it looks very easy, is that when we react, this is reaction, and this is response. And so when we have a choiceful response, then we're able to move the energy to a more, let's say, productive place. We're accepting, we're advising, we're asserting, we're encouraging. And when we move into that type of way or that type of behavior, it tends to shift the energy. And what I find fascinating is that under stress, you can almost map out where each personality type is going to be and how that triggers the other types. And so I think that's also one of the fascinating ways to work with type as well, to see how it translates into behaviors. So very quickly, the intent of this slide is to say there are so many tools that we can use, but I wanted to place personality as very, very important. And I'll just tell a quick story. When I had my first 360 feedback done on me, and this was years ago when I joined the Center for Brave Leadership, of course you hear some very good positives, but I had some negatives, and I tend to be more the feeling type, relationship-oriented people type. And a lot of my feedback centered around Peter avoids conflict. You know, Peter, you know, is helpful, but you know, the hard skills kept coming up. And the first time I had it done, I didn't understand personality, and I wasn't really exposed to it in a very effective way. And I came away feeling brutalized and thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much wrong with me. But then when I started to understand personality and what my profile is, all of a sudden it made sense that, you know, I'm relying on my innate natural skills, and what doesn't come naturally can be learned. So we can look at understanding type without pathologizing a person. And I think the danger of doing 360 feedback without a good understanding of type is it can be brutal, it can be pathologizing, and it can make people feel like there's something wrong with them if it's not done really well. And when you add personality to the mix, it can be very, very helpful. What I'll say about the interpersonal skills, if you know what the person's profile is, if they're a toughie, well, you know, it's hard to soften up a toughie, but it's crucial. And so you know who the bulldozers are, and so you can help them with the soft skills. And then if you see the ones that have the soft skills, now you know what they need to develop the hard skills, assertiveness, conflict management, and that type of thing. And then I do believe it plays a huge role in emotional intelligence, the self-awareness, the self-mastery, and the interpersonal skill. And I think you can also fold this into emotional intelligence training, and there's a number of great assessments out there that I think can be very complementary. And this is the slide that I'll end on, and that is the leadership action plan. There's a lot here, but when we understand type, we can form a more positive belief. We can be more accepting of people. And when we're operating out of positive emotions, as we saw with Barbara Fredrickson earlier in positivity, that when we're operating out of positive emotions, acceptance, caring, you know, excitement, anticipation, shared vision that really is engaging, then our behaviors are pro-social, proactive, and positive, and that helps us become great leaders. But if we make up stories that this person's too bossy, or they just don't have what it takes, and we get into negative emotions, anger, fear, and a whole host of others that come along with a negative assessment of someone, then how we see people is how we treat them right from the beginning. And then if we believe something negative about somebody that triggers a negative emotion, like being judgmental, critical, etc., that then can make us appear dominant and hostile. It shuts them down, and then the effect on our leadership is we shut people down often, and we blame them for being shut down, is one example. And so I think that at the end, when you help people become aware that, yes, we can reframe things, when we have empathy and understanding, and we operate out of positive emotions, now we can actually be a whole lot more effective with our relationships with our team and as leaders in our company. And it takes in the very middle to be aware, to really be able to own what we need to own, clean it up, and make sure we're held accountable so that we be the kind of people that we're all capable of. So I think that, for me, is a place to stop, and then maybe this will bring up a discussion or dialogue that you know, might be useful.
Okay, Peter, thanks a lot. Indeed, there are some interesting questions. First of all, there's a person, I don't know if she's still online, Gail Thompson, who has a technical question on one of your previous slides. I think it would bring us back into the work. So I would invite Gail to send me a little email, and I will forward it to Peter, because it may bring us a little bit too far here. So Gail, please be invited to send me a mail, and I will forward it to Peter with your question. Then another one, more at the end of your presentation, is well, the things like introverts and extroverts. I myself
I'll go to that slide.
Slight reference for introversion. But how possible is it to be ambivert? I mean, extrovert, introversion.
Yeah, well, I read Travis Bradbury wrote a great article on the ambivert, and I hesitated bringing it up because I didn't want to add another part. But if you look at in between the ambivert, and I think that I tend to be an ambivert, and the way I describe myself is I am highly extroverted. I thrive on this, and I'm really energized being here today. But if I don't have 2 or 3 hours alone to reflect, to think, and have my door closed and have it quiet, I become very disconcerted, let's say. So the ambivert, you know, what Travis Bradbury highlighted is it's somebody who has the qualities of being an extrovert and an introvert, and has been able to synthesize it and be very, very energized, communicating with people, but also being a good listener and being introverted and reflective. And in his research, he found that they made better salespeople. They tended to be a lot more successful. What I'll say about that is Carl Jung did say in his work that the job of the extrovert is to be more introverted, and the job of the introvert is to be more extroverted. So again, not to simply rely on our energy and say, that's just the way I am, get used to it. But the introvert, it would be very helpful if they became more extroverted. In the Myers-Briggs language, it's activating the inferior functions, and that's transformative. And the introvert, or the extrovert, excuse me, who is really focused on, his energy level, would do very well to become more introverted, reflective, mindful, and aware how important it is to give introverts the space or call on them, when there's a meeting. So I think the goal is really, in a sense, to be an ambivert. I think the article that I read, did say that it tended to be a natural kind of phenomena, but I believe that all of us can become ambiverts, and it would certainly help us tremendously if we're committed to.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question, and thank you for that.
Well, it came from one of our participants. Thanks a lot. Another thing, this is of course about the link between type and coaching and development, but I know some companies, and apparently some of the participants know them as well, who use this for hiring purposes, for recruitment purposes. In Belgium, it's illegal. In Belgium, you risk very serious deontological problems. I don't know in the rest of the world.
Well, I'm glad that you said that. None of the assessments that I've worked with are validated for hiring, and I don't believe they should be used for promotion as well. I think sometimes, let's say if you're opening a restaurant and you want somebody to be welcoming to the public, it would be helpful if you had someone who was extroverted, or who could be extroverted, and someone who knew how to welcome people. And I don't think you need an assessment like the DISC or Peoplemap or Colors or any that are out there to do that. I think you can take a look and ask some very insightful questions. Where do you get your energy? How do you like, how do you like meeting new people? Does that energize you? How do you deal with conflict? So again, what doesn't come naturally can be learned. And if there's a danger, if you hire for type, if you have a preconceived notion that you need bulldozers, again, bulldozers often self-select to go into the higher levels of management. And I do think it is important to have a diversity of type, but I think you can get there without having to give them an assessment. I like to look at all of these as tools, like a hammer, and a hammer can build a wall and it can build trust and communication, but a hammer can also hit somebody in the head and be destructive. And I think these are very useful tools when they're used appropriately, but inappropriately they can be destructive. And I think that's probably a good way for me to address that, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Peter. It's another one. In what type of situations in a team is it actually useful to start referring to type? I mean, there can be a lot of situations where team coaching or individual coaching would be useful, but where precisely or when precisely is type, working with type, the most appropriate? When do you as a coach clearly see, now I need something with type? Okay,
great. Well, here's how I use it. And again, I think that it's going to depend on a number of variables. One of my specialties is preventing executive derailment, and kind of in a flip way, I introduce myself sometimes. I work with angry executives, and then all of a sudden I started getting many referrals, and these tend to be those that are high in the DISC, high DC, leader, Peoplemap, leader task, but drivers, analytics. I tend to use type in the very first way, and the reason is because it's very positive. It doesn't pathologize, and what it does is it helps people understand how they relate, how they communicate, how they lead in a very positive way. And when I look at coaching, part of the process is helping them build awareness of self, awareness of others, and then recognizing how they can flex other types. So I use it as a foundational part. And this is, of course, after the intake to find out, well, what's the situation, what's going on, where are they stuck, where are they blocked. And then in a very engaging way, I'll work with personality to help them understand it's no wonder they're experiencing these dynamics. And very often people are unaware. They think, well, everybody should be like me. And oftentimes after the coaching engagement or teamwork is over, I'll ask people what was the most important thing they learned. And I often hear, well, I learned that people are different, and it's okay. And I learned that not everybody has to be like me, and that's okay. And I think that's very, very profound. So for me, the short answer to that question is I tend to use it as a foundational piece, and then build on that with either other assessments or the kind of dialogues to help them start moving through whatever it is that they need to move through or accomplish.
Okay, Peter, thank you.
So,
perhaps one more.
okay.
It's a question that goes back to some percentages. There are now more people that ask the same question. In an earlier slide, you said something about 10% driver, 68% relationship. What's the other 22%?
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so I'm going back to that slide right now. So if you look at percentage, 60% are relationship, and that could include those that I'm going to say people-oriented and expressive. You know, and the Peoplemap is people, free spirit. The DISC, it would be SI, and then there's the other variation. So you have about 28% that would be in the quadrant where you see relationship expressive, and then you have about roughly the same that are relationship analytical. And so these would be folks who are detailed, thorough, analytical, hardworking, and they often don't like change, but are great system makers, and they can be people-oriented. And then you have also those that are the more entrepreneurial, rebellious, free-thinking, needing a lot of autonomy, and they can also be people types. They tend to be about 28%, give or take a little bit. With the drivers, you can be driver expressive, you know, and that's the profile of many entrepreneurs that I've seen and worked with, that they're driven, but they need a tremendous amount of autonomy, and they need personal freedom, but they have such a drive, and they see the big picture, that these are often the entrepreneurs. And so again, if you look at the drivers being about 9%, and again, this is just an estimation, and it's based on the research of Mike Willibridge, is that you have roughly maybe about 5 or 6% who would be driver expressive or driver analytical based on his research. And I'm sure depending on the program that you're using, you may find some variances in that. But it does give an idea that, for me, if you are, let's say, in a quadrant or the half where you're either driver expressive, driver analytical, about 68% of the workforce, the population, are going to be relationship oriented. Now, there are also some subsets. I taught developmental psychology for 13 years at community college, and the nursing students, that was a required course. And what I found is 90% of them were relationship oriented. They were either relationship analytical or relationship expressive. And then when I did some work in hospitals and in professional offices, I found the same kind of phenomena. Nurses, nonprofits, universities, you know, the vast majority of them are relationship oriented, but yet the ones running it, even in a psychological office or a group of psychologists, the lead psychologist tended to be a driver, but he was a people type or relationship driver. And I found, based on the different professions, an incredible, interesting kind of phenomena is that, again, if you look at personality as an energy, we tend to go where our energy goes. And those in the helping professions tend to disproportionately be relationship oriented.
Okay.
And thus,
I have to interrupt you here because we're at the end of our hour. If you still have time and participants still have time, please remain online. But for those having to leave and those needing to send passwords, the second password is night. You have the day and you have the night. The second password is night. Only those who lived any technical issues during the webinar or those having participated by Bridgeline need to send passwords. All the rest you don't need to send anything. So for those